Very good evening to everybody. Greetings on the eve of Ambedkar Jayanti, the 131st Ambedkar Jayanti. We today evening welcome all of you to this discussion between members of our editorial team at the Economic and Political Weekly. The event is titled Thinking with Ambedkar Today. And at this point of time, there are so many different ways and approaches with which people look and engage with Ambedkar and reflect and also take forward those reflections in everyday praxis. And we hope to have an open discussion among the members of the editorial team. Discussing some things about how Ambedkar at this point of time is an ubiquitous figure in both politics, but also in intellectual and academic discussions at this point of time. And apart from that, Ambedkar in many ways, some would say is a preeminent figure in Indian politics, having engaged with diverse streams across time and continues to engage through people who take forward his work. So we have with us today two people who are, I would say, very actively engaged in working and reading and reflecting with Ambedkar, who are part of our editorial team. And we thought it would be good to get them into a discussion and try and take forward something. So I would first, they don't need much introduction, but we have Ankit Kawade, who is a member of our editorial team and also a doctoral student at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. And then we have Professor Gopal Guru, who is the editor of the Economic and Political Weekly. I welcome both of them to this discussion. And how we will proceed with this discussion is that we will have short statements or presentations by them, and then we will try to enter into a discussion with them. Followed by that, we'll try and open up questions from the audience. And I would request all of you, once we have finished with the discussion, to put your questions in the chat box, and we could go through them based on the limitations of time and all of that. So I would first invite Ankit to make a statement in this discussion, and let's go on with that. So Ankit, please.
Thank you so much, Rohan, and hello everyone. A very happy Ambedkar Jayanti to you in advance. So today I wish to speak about an image or a photograph related to Dr. Ambedkar's life that I saw recently. And have been thinking about it since then. I shall show that image in a while, but before that, a little backstory about why I became interested in that particular image of Ambedkar in the first place. So there is a village called Somnath that is located in the Chandrapur district of Vidarbha, Maharashtra, which is well known for its rehabilitation program for leprosy afflicted patients. As someone who was born and brought up in that district, I have had the occasion to visit Somnath as well as the well-known place called Anandwan, the settlement near Varora, where Baba Amte had first established the Maharogi Seva Samiti for curing and rehabilitating leprosy patients. So when I was in Somnath in 2015, I had the opportunity to speak to several survivors of leprosy, or Kusht Rog as it is called in Marathi. Everyone I spoke to had a story about how they were ousted from their own homes after their families and village communities suspected that they had contracted leprosy. They had extremely heart-wrenching details to share where they somehow survived in nearly homeless conditions before they were informed about Amte's project of rehabilitation, who was himself a medical doctor. So the survivors I spoke with were all engaged in what is called manual work, pottery, sculpting, farming, handicrafts, cooking, masonry, handlooming, carpentry, etc. Even after surviving leprosy, their hands had nonetheless sustained deep physical disfigurement, with most of their fingers either having become stiff or stunted. So my conversations with leprosy survivors in Somnath revealed how much they related their bodily disability with their newfound dignity and respect in laboring with their hands. There were several such conversations, but one narrative is distinctly etched in my mind, where a leprosy survivor told me, we spoke in Marathi, so this is what he said in English. We live, translated into English, we live with self-respect now. Earlier, we were treated like untouchables. Or in Marathi, he had said verbatim, आम्ही आता सन्मानाने जगतो. पहिले लोक आमच्यासोबत अस्पृश्यांसारखं वागायचे. End of quote. So I remember this statement very distinctly because of the comparison of leprosy with untouchability, where the leprosy survivor likened his condition to that of facing the same kind of stigmatized and discriminatory treatment that caste Hindu society shows towards the untouchables. What I also found noteworthy in this statement was the peculiar element of being witness to the exclusion of untouchables, which the person found as being similar to their own social segregation after contracting leprosy. I did notice then, however, that such a comparison would have been very unlikely to occur in the mind of someone who was an untouchable by birth. And this is precisely something that was the subject of what troubled me after this conversation. The popular meanings of untouchability in our society that lends its usages to various kinds of sufferers towards making a comparative allusions of being treated like untouchables. We also hear terms like political untouchability used by certain politicians. So this is exactly the question that troubled me. What does it mean to be treated like an untouchable when you are in fact not an untouchable by birth? So some years later, I was struck by a sentence occurring in Babasaheb Ambedkar's 1945 book, What Congress and Gandhi Have Done to the Untouchables. Very, very interestingly, this sentence was an exact inversion of what I had heard from the leprosy survivor in Somnath. And it read, this is the quote from Ambedkar's book, the Hindu religion to which the untouchables are tied, instead of providing for them an honorable place, brands them as lepers, not fit for ordinary intercourse, end of quote. So Ambedkar was utilizing the horror and stigma attached to the disease of leprosy in colonial India to depict the miserable condition of the untouchables in this sentence. And here too, the element of comparison between leprosy and untouchability, between lepers and untouchables, provoked several questions in my mind. What does it mean to be treated like a leper when you are in fact not suffering from leprosy? Ambedkar highlights the element of exclusion from ordinary social intercourse here as the justification for making this comparison between lepers and untouchables. Very importantly, leprosy was considered to be infectious or contagious at the time when Ambedkar was writing. And the element of literal not touching and not sharing proximate spaces with leprosy sufferers by society at large must certainly have been in Ambedkar's mind when he made this particular comparison. There is a lot to be said about a possible history of entanglement between the medical condition of leprosy in a caste-based social structure that is always already determined by the practices of untouchability, thus implying a medicalized hypersensitivity towards notions of not touching, social distance, segregation, excommunication, quarantine, humiliation, exclusion, etc. Such themes or such words might also ring some bells regarding the COVID-19 pandemic that we are all living through. The question of this vexed historical relationship between disability and the social practice of untouchability lingered in my mind ever since I came across the comparison between leprosy and untouchability in both the narrative of the leprosy survivor and in Ambedkar's text. So this was all till recently, but the substance of this question came back to me very, very recently, almost like 20 days back, when I came across the following image of the impressions of Ambedkar's hands. So I will just show that image to all of you. So I hope you can see this image. So these are the impressions of Babasaheb Ambedkar's hands that were taken by his biographer Dhananjay Keer in the year 1936. And this is a representative image of the hand of a leprosy survivor. You can see how the fingers of the hands have gone immense physical disfigurement. So I will stop sharing the screen now. Yeah. So I could not find any details about the source or possible reasons for why Ambedkar got made such an impressionistic image of his hands. However, the image of Ambedkar's hands certainly made me remember the hands of the leprosy survivors, given that I could not stop thinking about that one comparison made by Ambedkar and the leprosy survivor both. So at the risk of some speculation and in the spirit of thinking with Ambedkar today, I wondered what is the relationship between the hands of an untouchable and the hands of a leper. Following the leprosy survivors and Ambedkar's metaphorical substitution between the leper and the untouchable, we can point out that there are indeed very discernible physical differences between the hands of a leper and an untouchable. An untouchable's hands may not suffer from a physical ailment or disfigurement, and yet an untouchable's hands, like a leper's hands, have historically represented a moral menace in the minds of our caste Hindu society at large. Experiences from Ambedkar's own life, as they are recorded in his autobiographical fragment, Waiting for a Visa, reveals the instance where he was barred from drinking water at his school because the touch of his hands was polluting to the common water tap. He had to wait for the school peon to open the tap for him every time he felt thirsty in his school. So maybe Ambedkar wanted to record the sheer innocence of an untouchable's hands for posterity, so that those who come after him would be forced to think about what was it about these hands that they were subjected to the cruel practice of untouchability. Hands that labor, manufacture, and write, hands that cook, serve, and feed, hands that give, receive, and embrace, are turned into hands that are feared, shunned, and jabbed away in a society that is maniacally overrun by the notion of untouchability. For how can an analysis of untouchability be complete without first investigating what and whose hands can or cannot do something in Hindu society? Indeed, a phenomenological perspective into thinking about caste would compel us in precisely this direction of questioning. So to conclude, I'll just recount this one statement, famous statement by the philosopher Martin Heidegger, who had very provocatively written that animals do possess organs that can hold, grip, and stretch, but animals do not essentially have hands. According to Heidegger, only human beings have hands, and hands are what separates humans from the animals in their most essential species-related difference. From an anthropological standpoint, it might be true that all human beings have hands. However, from a sociological or a historical standpoint, the disease of leprosy and the practice of untouchability reveals to us that all human beings may not have the same kind of hands, and that all hands are not equal. Ambedkar had very forcefully written that a Hindu would prefer to be inhuman rather than take the risk of touching an untouchable in his book Untouchables or the Children of India's Ghetto. It is within the notion of inhumanity itself that one can locate the problem of the hands of those who practice untouchability towards a whole social group. And perhaps it is in pointing towards the very irreducibility of being an equal human person that explains why Ambedkar got an impression made of his hands. I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ankit, for that very thought-provoking, but also very emotional and deep reflection on something that probably some people would overlook in many ways, and also for finding that image which many of us have probably never known of, and so this in itself is a a very momentous revelation in some ways. So thank you for that. There are some, I mean, we can have this discussion later, but I mean, just to give one, parting reflection is that is the hands that write, manufacture, and cook and labor also are hands that point in a direction. They suggest and indicate a direction to go, which were also Ambedkar's hands. So to just add that bit and to then move on to Professor Guru and So you can
Okay.
go with your state.
Thank you, Rohan, for your brief introduction of mine and Ankit. And I also appreciate the efforts made by Divya and Priyam to organize this discussion on the eve of 131st anniversary of Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar. We all join in celebrating it. We were actually thinking of the title of this discussion, and we collectively realized that thinking with Ambedkar could be the most apt title to reflect on the relationship between the scholars and the philosophical theoretical work done by Ambedkar. So my presentation will slightly drift away from what Ankit has said. I agree with what Rohan has said about Ankit's presentation. That in fact is a very reflective, very and deep understanding of the relationship between hand and labor, laboring hands. Hands also are used to produce a fist. So we have to connect that to that as well. So just to politically make hands so agential. So that's my submission. We can discuss about it. But anyway, let me spend about 10 minutes to say what I want to say. Thinking with Babasaheb Ambedkar, let me start my short presentation with a couple of clarifications. We are talking about the limits of not Bhimrao Ambedkar, but limits of those scholars, commentators, and political activists. While reading with or thinking with Ambedkar, I also refrain from talking about the limits of Dalit political activism. There is an ethic in mentioning on priority the limits of Dalit political activism. This is because the robust internal critique makes right to comment on larger politics morally defensible and sound. This is what Ambedkar did when he organized the meeting only of the mass for telling them the importance of conversion in 1936. However, I must make a quick observation that Dalit politics is more about the instrumental deal rather than normative ideal as propounded by Ambedkar. So there is a difference between deal and ideal. In the Dalit common imagination, Ambedkar has been reduced or elevated to an icon, and he has been subjected to wholesale exercise in hagiography. Let me highlight some of the core points that are associated with the act of thinking with Ambedkar. The limits of the nature of the limits is more discursive rather than political, although politics is internal to such discursive nature of limits. Let's take the first point. Polemical thinking polemically with Ambedkar has been a serious limitation, emanating from the narrow interpretation of Ambedkar by the commentators, whose number is quite significant these days. In polemics, these commentators required other figure or the figure of others who can be constructed as Ambedkar's adversary. Thus, Marx and Gandhi have been projected as the unavoidable political and ideological adversary of Ambedkar. Some scholars, while thinking with Ambedkar, make Ambedkar a freezing point. Ambedkar is denied discursive dynamism through the boring act of repetition. Although repetitions are important in some contexts, translations of Ambedkar's thought and work in various languages is also important, but such translations are also subjected to repetition. There are not many writings in Marathi where one could come across the philosophical propositions and theoretical insights that are produced, but they are available in Ambedkar's original writing. Such repetitions do not add to one's deep knowledge of Ambedkar's insight and philosophical propositions. These writings do not reveal to us the theoretical insights and philosophical propositions that become discernible through a close and careful thinking and reading with Ambedkar. Put differently, such repetitive exercise in writing can be accused of painting gray over gray. I was tempted to give the metaphor of Hegel's owl, which flies only in the dark. But it's a paradigmatic metaphor. I don't want to go into it, but I'm avoiding it here at the moment. Point 2, certain epistemological approaches to think with Ambedkar do have some serious limitations as well. For example, these scholars seem to have followed virtue epistemology to think with Ambedkar or read Ambedkar. From this point of view, it becomes it is treated to be enough for them to be competent with language skill and argumentative capacity and also conceptual clarity while thinking with Ambedkar. So there are 3 important criteria on which virtue epistemology is based. One is competence, argumentative capacity, and clarity. Apart from these 3, there are other criteria. One is required to be open-minded to put Ambedkar into comparative perspective. So open-mindedness is another character of virtue epistemology, and that would enable these scholars to put Ambedkar in a comparative perspective. And then compare him with certain continental philosophers, specifically Foucault, and German philosopher Walter Benjamin. Open-mindedness thus takes the open-mindedness taken up by these scholars takes Ambedkar around the globe, making him a planetary figure. Such scholars are indeed mindful of certain language and methodological protocols that are needed to embark on thinking with Ambedkar and doing research on him. Other characteristics of virtue epistemology is fair-mindedness. We talked about open-mindedness. Let's talk about fair-mindedness. These scholars apply certain amount of fair-mindedness, certain degree of fair-mindedness in marshalling several references to sustain Ambedkar's image as a comparative thinker. Some of the Ambedkar scholars demonstrate certain fairness to apportion plus points from the body of ideas of other thinkers with whom Ambedkar is to be compared. Being fair to Ambedkar is to strike the balance between, for example, Ambedkar on the one hand, Marx and Gandhi on the other. So these are some of the core points of virtue epistemology. Scholars have criticized this kind of virtue epistemology from different angles. But let me raise more serious limitations of such epistemological approach to thinking with Ambedkar. So I am actually providing 2 points to critique virtue epistemology. First, those who knowingly or unknowingly follow virtue epistemology fail to take into consideration ethical or prudential risks which would make them realize that it is risky to enter Ambedkar's text, which would demand new language to theorize his and his followers' humiliating experience. And Ankit has already mentioned this in his very moving presentation. And the narratives of humiliation and degradation of untouchables appear almost on every page of certain texts of Ambedkar. While you are actually reading or thinking or referring to Ambedkar's text, are you really aware about these speaking humiliation and talking degradation of the untouchable? At ethical level, such scholars also are expected to be ethically mindful that they do not inflict subtle forms of humiliation against the followers of Ambedkar. And I am just giving a hypothetical statement. Don't ask for any kind of example. you will have to find out, discover yourself how you are treated by scholars who are working on Ambedkar. Such epistemological move aids such scholars to forge unity of mind rather than experience. So this is my point which I'm raising several times. So while you can be conceptually together with other scholars who are working on Ambedkar, but it's very rare that you find yourself available for sharing, empathetically sharing experience of the untouchables. There is another problem with this virtue epistemology, that the adherents of such epistemology do not seem to appreciate that epistemology does carry with it a certain epistemic power, which in worst cases is used to educate certain kind of crookedness and cunningness. I'm sorry, I'm using very harsh words. I'm not supposed to use these words on this, but you know, we decided to be very frank these days on this occasion. So let me repeat this point. The adherents of such epistemology do not seem to appreciate that epistemology does carry with it certain epistemic power, which in worst cases is used to educate certain kind of a crookedness and cunningness, in using Ambedkar in order to suggest the discursive deficiency in thinking with and reading with Ambedkar. And this writing of scholars who form, I mean, the discursive deficiency is found in the writings of scholars who form the ontological bond with humiliating experience that Ambedkar himself had to suffer, and his followers continued to suffer. And Ankit again is required to be referred here to. So this is but there are two kinds of epistemology. There is one more epistemological move that people make to actually think with Ambedkar, and that is egalitarian. That the field of Ambedkar is free for everyone, including the Dalits and women and Adivas and everybody. But the boundaries, the rules of the game will be decided by somebody who is sitting at the top. So Dalits have to really follow that. So that egalitarian epistemology in its universal tone may actually be a problematic thing for the Dalit scholars. And the last point, Rohan, can I make a last point within 1 minute? Rohan?
Yes, please.
Yeah, the other one is more problematic, the sectarian or conservative epistemology. In this kind of epistemology, certain scholars think with Ambedkar, but think with Ambedkar with their group, their peer group only. They talk to each other, they refer to each other, they do not quote any other person, only them. So this is, there are m number of examples of this, but this is what is happening while we are thinking or reading, thinking with Ambedkar or reading Ambedkar. So my last plea, therefore, appeal is, we need to evolve and sincerely adopt new ethical norms for thinking and reading with Ambedkar. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Professor Guru, for those very open-minded and fair-minded and provocative statements all at the same time. I think we can have we can get the questions in a bit, but just maybe I could just briefly ask both of you to respond to two very basic things that I'd like to ask you. First, just I'd like to ask Ankit, which was the point that I made, is that and how Professor Guru also referred to the fact that hands also build the fist or the other finger that point in a direction.
Yes.
That sometimes in going or referring to the body in its relation to a particular disability, the way disability is constructed or its normative order in the mainstream is constructed sometimes forces you to then collapse. How does one then bring out use that notion of the body in an emancipatory politics in some sense, that when the normative order is of disability, then how does one find the ideal of emancipation from that, which is so central and fundamental to Baba Sahib Ambedkar's thought. So if you could just give a brief.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a foundational question, so to say. I mean, I think even an hour would be less for really thinking through this question, because I mean, personally, as I try to read more about these issues, scholars from, say, disability studies and feminist scholarship really gives me a lot of food for thought when it comes to thinking about emancipatory conceptions of the body. So this is something that I find so this is something that I think is really fruitful, so to say, in how can the various conceptions of the body that one finds in, say, anti-caste literature or anti-caste thought, how can they be brought into conversation with other ideologies, other ways of thinking, which are also attempting to think about emancipatory conceptions of the body. So one example that I can provide here is from, say, Baba Sahib Ambedkar's own work. So there he questions not so much the physical, because we also sometimes, I think, make the mistake of conceiving of the body in purely biologistic terms. So Ambedkar very forcefully, and I mean, if I can say that, also anticipates some of the recent developments that has happened in, say, feminist theories, where they've said that the body is a metaphysical construct. It's not merely a biological, something that is there, made of flesh and blood and bones and so on. So yeah, so Ambedkar points out that what exactly is the body of the myth of the Purusha that is found in the Rig Veda, for example, where it is said that the Varnas emerge from the 4 parts of the Purusha's body. So even before Ambedkar, Phule had also questioned this element of, and I would say from a feminist standpoint, that if the Purusha is able to give birth to whole classes of groups from each body part, then each body part might also, secrete blood, because how else is a body part able to give birth to something or someone, unless it has the properties of the female body and the female uterus. So so this was something that was pointed out by Phule as well. So Ambedkar questions this whole conception of the body in terms of equality. He says that if the Hindus wanted each class to be equal, for instance, so they would have constructed a kind of a body where all kinds of social classes are emerging from the same body part. So he pointed out an example, saying that there are many figures, or there are many gods and imageries of gods and goddesses which have multiple heads, multiple heads. So you could have had each social class born from one head of the particular god. Why did one particular class had to be born from the feet, and why were the others born from the arms and thighs and the head and so on? So very tentatively, I can only say that it is the notion of equality itself that we can foreground when we are trying to think about more emancipatory conceptions of the body. And the more difficult task here is to detect or to investigate and to research exactly what nodes of inequality or what nodes of inegalitarianism reside in so many other conceptions of the body, which might have popular appeal in the larger society. So you would still hear today that since people have the practice of touching the feet of elders in Hindu society, the Shudras could not have been given a inferior position in that social schema. So you have all these kinds of arguments repeated ad nauseum even today. So I would say that the more difficult task is to really counter these popularly constructed images of the body, which very, very cunningly sanction social inequality, even while saying that no, each body part does its different things. So each varna also has its different duties and so on and so forth. So I think yeah, these are some of the things that I think we can think about when it comes to thinking more deeply about the question of the body. Yeah.
Thanks. Just Professor Guru, just a very based on, I mean, you've laid it out very extensively, the scheme on how you've looked at scholarship on Ambedkar and the different ways in which people try and engage intellectually and produce discourse in different ways. So this is something that you have written in one of your columns or referred to it across the board, is that in some ways, a lot of this comparative scholarship in many ways then creates a fragmented discourse or a fragmented intellect or intellectual, and therefore denying a unity to the work of Ambedkar, and by virtue of that unity, a universality in some ways of Ambedkar. So how would you respond to that? How comparisons of these very casual kinds, actually, in some ways, fragment something that has a very deep organic unity, the work of Baba Saheb Ambedkar. So just.
Yeah, thanks, Rohan. Before I get on to your questions, let me quickly respond to this notion of body in Ambedkar. Actually, it's a very important notion that he handles, and Ankit has actually very ably elaborated on it. But then there is one question that was actually flashing on the screen. That is, what is the role of body in emancipation? The quick answer is that you achieve emancipation by actually overcoming your ego. So ego actually is built up, sustained by the structure, shape, color, skin of the body. And Ambedkar, of course, Gandhi also reflected on this one. The other important reference that we get in Ambedkar is that he is using body as the metaphor for society. If the body is diseased, you require to really treat it. So what is your starting point to treat it? You start with the negative vocabulary, that there is a disease, negative vocabulary, there's a disease and we have to treat it. But here, we are only talking, and his complaint is that you are talking about the society as a very canonized body, which doesn't require any kind of treatment. Is there, it has to be followed. This is the caste. So these are two quick points that I thought I would. And the third point which would interest you, Rohan, is that, without hands, you cannot gain respect. So labor and hand and self-respect, these are all tight things. So we can discuss that later. But this important point you're raising is that how the comparative approach to Ambedkar might really lead to some kind of fragmentation of scholarship, which is fine, but it tends to fragment the unified theoretical alternatives that Ambedkar has provided. And that's why we call him as a system builder. We call him as a universal system builder. Why do we call him? Because he's actually giving a very, that's why he says Buddhism. Buddhism is not a fragmented. It's actually a very carefully, comprehensively thought out structure of imagination, a structure of thinking, and a structure of transcendence. And so I think Buddhism is one example, but there is some kind of a there is some kind of overarching principles that he has actually evolved. If your fragmented scholarship is feeding into that, you might call it essentialism, but that's what you have to be faithful and fair to Ambedkar. You just can't take the Ambedkar around in your own fashion and in your own liking. So that is, I think, very important. So I think he refuses to be collapsed into postmodernism, therefore. But there are scholars who are actually reducing into postmodernism, which is absolutely awful, to say the least.
Thank you for that response. So we just will open up some questions we've received. I think one of them you've already responded to from the chat box. So, I mean, and I think Ankit also in his response kind of has directly responded to the question. There is one question we have received, which is directed at Professor Guru, and I think Ankit, you can also pitch in, which is, I mean, it deals with a very old discussion, but also very new and fresh each day. If caste is a system of inequality and discrimination, then why did Ambedkar allow the system of reservation based on the same unequal caste system? So, it's a very, standard question, as Ankit said, that we have to dispel a lot of these very simplistic, or not simplistic, but very these questions that come up, and how do we engage with it? It's important. So if there is a brief response you would like to give to this question, and I would really request others also to send in their questions at the same time. So if you would like to give a very brief, like a quick, like how in television debates you give a quick response. So if you have a quick television debate response.
Sir, you want to answer that first?
Yeah, let me. I mean, this is the often repeated question, and we have actually answered it several thousand times. But let me quickly repeat my answer. So I think caste is a category. It's not it is not an ontologically reified object. Okay. So caste is a category, just as class is a category. Now, when you are using caste as a category to actually mobilize your constituency for the for gaining justice, achieving equality, dignity. Now, the content of this caste as a category is paradoxical. For example, and I have mentioned it several times. For example, the inner dimension or inner content of this caste is equality, egalitarianism. Why are caste movements organizing themselves? They are organizing for perpetuating caste or overcoming caste. Simple question. A reservation is a small bit of actually doing it away. Okay. The outer expression of this category is paradoxical in the sense that it is caste which is not universal, and therefore, but there is no other alternative. Class is still arriving at the imagination of the Dalits. So, and caste, class will not really entertain reservation anytime. It will really talk about privileges. So that's one point that I would like to respond to. The other question somebody raised was about what is the new language. It's a negative language. Is the language which has to be developed reading Ambedkar fully. Ranabhav Sate. Actually, I forgot to mention Ranabhav Sate. Ranabhav Sate says, the universe is not sustained by somebody's, it's not resting on the hood of something, but it's actually on the hands of the workers like this. It's sustained on this. The whole earth is sustained and rested on the hands of workers. So I think it's a hand metaphor. Rohan is so significant in the discourse of emancipation of the Dalits and subalterns. But we need to really work more on this. It's there in literature, but not in the formal theoretical tract. So that's the point. Is the negative language that one is talking about is the language which is not the imitation of the formal affirmative language. Like if you have justice, you have to develop the theory of injustice. Do we have really a theory of injustice in our country or inequality? We make sense of inequality and justice only in the context of justice and equality. So I think the tautological move to privilege affirmative language over the negative is actually to imitate, to succumb to the mainstream discourse. So how many of us really have done theoretical preparation to really develop a theory? And this is a collective work, not somebody's or any one single person's task. So that's, and I'm just giving one example of why we don't have the theory of inequality or injustice. We have some reflections on humiliation now, but I'm sorry for this reference, but it is there. So I think we require, so what are we actually awake ourselves in the in the realm of negativity only. Abhav, oh, injustice is done to me, then comes justice. The in priority of your language, what comes to your operative language is injustice. Your political language is injustice, not justice is the post facto. But we unfortunately don't have a detailed track on this. Jutan, for example, there was a seminar on this. Do you have Jutan? Do you have theory of leftover food? Jutan. So I did something on this. So I think I'm working on this. So I don't have complete, full, perfect preposition, the theoretical statement. I'm just working on it.
I don't know if you can read this question we have received. There are two questions. One is relates to if you can see this question, refers to the work of Aniket Zawade, who speaks to the corporeal schema by prioritizing touch rather than the body for rethinking sociality and the social, and the entailments of his arguments for thinking Ambedkar both globally and comparatively. This is a response to your point on that comparative. So would anyone like a brief response to this? And maybe I guess this question is a little independent from the other question. So
yeah,
would like to.
Suppose this touch thing is a very tactical touch. It's not separate from body. Body touch can make sense only in terms of the skin. Okay. So how can you separate? I mean, we have actually done three articles. Myself, Uday, and Sunil. In EPW only, after our great philosopher Aniket passed away. So there is a discussion on that. He would like to visit the person who has questioned this. We have no time to do it, but I think we are engaged with Aniket in these three pieces that we produced in EPW. And then somebody is asking Rohan that what is Alan Badu's ethics, but I don't have time to do it at the moment. I have not read Alan Badu in clear terms.
Right. Yeah, there's a request to reshare the image briefly. So, I mean, if you want to do that, or we could do that it's up to you, Ankit. If you want to do it now or a little later. But there's another question. It is at times argued that Ambedkar was appropriated into the constitution making projects, and he could have given better chances to the politics he spearheaded by refusing to participate. How would both of you respond?
Ankit.
Okay, so the question of Ambedkar's constitutionalism is very interesting, because we often think that there are maybe two ways to look at it. The first is that since Ambedkar is was the chairman of the drafting committee of the constitution, all the praises as well as all the praises as well as the blames for whatever whatever the constitution signifies right now should go to Dr. Ambedkar. That is the first one perspective maybe. And the second perspective is that Ambedkar himself did not play too much of a role in the making of the constitution. Hence, we should not also overestimate Ambedkar's whatever constitutionalism as the only legitimate mode of practicing politics, and that maybe there are other ways of practicing politics that we may overlook when we overestimate Ambedkar's constitutionalism. So I think both of these perspectives have their own merits as well as demerits. Very, very briefly, this is something that I want to still point out. It is that this also connects to the notion of the state and how do we assess Ambedkar's orientation towards the modern state and so on, as opposed to someone like Gandhi, for instance. So a very tentative response to that would be to not overlay the question about what exactly does the constitution represent for Ambedkar. So this is something that I have also slightly worked on, and there I have tried to argue that the Constitution represents to Ambedkar a counter legal measure to fighting or doing or undoing the legalistic effects of Brahminism that one witnesses in everyday society. So this connects to the question of reservation as well, which is to say that how does one do away years and years of entrenched and deep inequalities without mounting a legal or a juridical pressure or a counter against it. So Ambedkar's constitutionalism, Ambedkar's high hopes with what the Article 17 or what the abolition of untouchability might do in our society, what the preamble might do in our society, what other provisions. This can also be connected to the SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act. One might say that this act is not implemented very well and so on, but the fact that this act exists in the law books is extremely important, because at least the state provides the most vulnerable sections of the society some legal space towards legally challenging the deeply entrenched forms of inequalities of our society. And all through Ambedkar's engagements with law and Ambedkar's own position as being a barrister at law can be seen through this perspective of the fact that one cannot only have merely or limitedly political or limitedly economic responses to the problem of inequalities. One also needs to have a very deep and comprehensive legal or juridical challenge to the problem of inequality in society. So yeah.
Yeah, Rohan, I think certain questions are rhetorical, and they have their own problems, like reservation and caste connection is a rhetorical point. The other is that Ambedkar was appropriated into writing a constitution is another rhetorical question, which is a serious problem. Before when we are asking this question, we should see the problems with this question. The question is that when you are saying Ambedkar was appropriate, when you are suggesting that as if Ambedkar was appropriated into writing the constitution, so you are actually reducing Ambedkar to an object, as if Ambedkar doesn't have his own agency, and he was actually told. But this is unfair. I mean, he was a multifaceted personality. And he was all the time trying to see how one can really help the untouchables and other different sections of society. So that the pragmatism is one aspect of his thinking. But he doesn't perfect pragmatism, he's aware. He's actually using it only to transcend it. That's why he says, we are hereafter entering into contradictions. We will be politically equal, but economically unequal. Why did he say that? It was simply a tool. He had his own mind, and he fought several battles, constitutional battles, both in the Constitutional Assembly and in the Parliament. I think before we ask this question, I think we should also think that what is the logic of the question.
So just one more question we have, which is, I would read the question out and also, maybe request you to just reflect on one thing that I feel the question also points at. The question is, that the state and minority text may give a better understanding to think of our Ambedkar's idea of politics, that text. So this is the question that that text helps in giving a better idea of politics. So related to this, I would also take up from this question also is this thing of finding one text and making that as the center of, Ambedkar's thinking or reflect, so what does that, tendency also in scholarship reflect on from leading from this question, that this text says it all, or this is the text where you'll understand the primary point that is being made. So if you could just, respond to that.
Now, you already answered this question, and it's unfair to really center one whole thing on one text. Whereas, why did you write 35? There are many more to come.
No, but how does that happen, and why does that also happen?
Because you have that certain kind of prejudice tied up to your project of emancipation. For example, if somebody actually is driven by this idea of socialism, okay, and the states and minorities, a blueprint for socialist 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 idea of Indian society. So you will find that radical suggestions made by Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar. But that, if you really are coming from that particular perspective, then you will certainly privilege one text. Just as the castewalas will really privilege only annihilation of caste. But annihilation caste is not the text on caste. I have said it several times. It is a very, very important statement on ethics. It's an ethical text. So there is a philosophical angle all the time running through his ideas. He's not actually he's not sending philosophy and theory on a big permanent holiday. So I think that's the politics of actually privileging one text over others. Reading the text is fine. Then you can go for the exegetical exercise. I have no problem. But there's a politics, and there is also a profundity involved in reading together several texts, including his poems. Why not? His poems, his reflections, music, his music on animals, and all that is a comprehensive, is a paradigmatic take that one finds in his.
But Ankit, would you like to respond to this question about state and minority, the text itself also, that it gives a better understanding of the idea of politics?
Yeah, I would broadly agree with what Professor Guru said. I think it would be a little dangerous to privilege one text over others for saying, okay, this is what exactly provides his. There's this term, no, Brahma Vakya or something like that. This is the line that is not to be crossed when it comes to thinking about a particular question. I think any act of scholarship which takes into account a particular thinker will take into account the whole corpus of that thinker. And as Professor Guru said, not only the written corpus, but also the fact that Ambedkar was engaged in, for instance, sketching. So one maybe example that I can point out here is that Ambedkar was also a good sketch artist, and he painted a portrait of the Buddha right at the end of his life, which was really special for two reasons. First, that the Buddha was standing, because most of the depictions of the Buddha depict him as sitting. And the second was that the Buddha's eyes were open. Yeah. So Ambedkar is probably one of the, maybe to my knowledge, I think the only person who depicted the Buddha with his eyes open, saying that my Buddha has his eyes open to the injustices that happen in the society. So yeah, I think when we take into account Ambedkar's work, one has to, even for instance, something that I tried to do today, just taking into account the impressions of his hands, and try to think about what really that symbolizes for both Ambedkar scholarship as well as something for our own questions today. So I think, yeah, one has to take into account multiple trajectories of a particular thinker rather than, being...
And in addition to this, and I'm not privileging Marathi knowledge of mine, but I think the most profound statements that have come on equality, Samta and socialism are in 1938 in Samta and other journals, Janata and Samta. So I think there's also limitations to have access only to English writings that are available. We require to translate those Marathi into English. Translations do perform a very radical function of disseminating the knowledge.
Okay, so I think we are pretty much out of time, and maybe I would invite Ankit to share the image of Ambedkar, Babasaheb Ambedkar's hands. Yeah. As I just want to thank, very briefly would like to thank Divya, Priyam, and other members of the editorial team for helping make this event possible. And I'd also like to thank Ankit and Professor Guru for this very...
Not at all, it is our duty.
Very...
as a member of the editorial team of EPW, we are duty bound, everybody.
Yes, but also I think on this, on the eve of Ambedkar Jayanti, yes. I think I mean to also have a moment of reflection along with celebration and commemoration.
Yes, very true.
take all these into account. And I think Ankit's presentation also gave us a very
different
neat sense of, and a very different sense of how we can reflect on this day, which means so much to all of us. So, but if you'd like to say something, some passing, and then we could close some final comments, and then we could close the event. If you'd like to
you
say
are asking
something.
me, Rohan? No,
Yes, Professor Guru, as editor
I think
of Economic and Political
I must admit that Ankit's mine is an ongoing complaint that I have not really formally written, but I have written about 800 words now. And so I might elaborate on them, maybe if it is needed. But Ankit's presentation was absolutely refreshing because, and he quoted Heidegger. What is new thinking? What is thinking with Ambedkar? Thinking with Ambedkar, you feel bored with the writings that people have done on Ambedkar. So that's why new thinking. So it's a very, very, very good start that Ankit has given, a different angle altogether. So I thank him, and I thank Priyam and Divya for taking all the trouble to put this together. And thanks, Rohan, for your very, very able, competent, concise moderation.
Thank you, sir. And I just, in closing, I'd just like to say a lot of this, if you follow EPW, please subscribe to it. We would encourage you to subscribe to EPW if you haven't already. But also, some of these reflections, come out in our editorial pages and also in the editor's desk on a weekly basis. So if you could take time out to, read up, and they relate to very contemporary issues. So if you could take time to also read that, that will really add to the discussion. So thank you, everyone, and wishing you a very significant and wholesome Ambedkar Jayanti, and a radical revolutionary one too. And we hope to have